pertaining to murabaha, al-amr bil-shira'. And I make a distinction between this murabaha and the murabaha that we find in our books of fiqh, of traditional Islamic jurisprudence. The murabaha in the books of fiqh is basically a deferred sale or a spot sale with a declared profit. That's all it is. However, the murabaha that approached the banks or Islamic commercial banks was very different. This murabaha is basically a cost plus or markup financing, and it involves various structures. The structure involved the customer coming to the Islamic bank saying he wants to buy something. The Islamic bank then is able to get assurances from the customer through the idea of an original wa'd. That wa'd was then made to be binding, because if the bank was to go and buy the item, the customer was to renege on his wa'd, then the bank would end up with an asset. Once that's done, the bank could mirror its sale or its buying of the desired item and sale to the customer in a way that mirrored very much the effects of a credit, interest-based credit loan. Now this, I don't want to go into the debate of murabaha, but I want to say that the banking mode of murabaha was not universally accepted. But what it did do is it brought about a massive change. From 1980s, Islamic finance began to move beyond the simple Islamic banking model of paying investment account holders a variable profit share. Contracts such as mudaraba were found to be impractical because of their profit-sharing nature being inconsistent with the legal environment they operated in. About this time, we find big multinational financial corporations entering the Islamic finance domain. Whereas two of the biggest Islamic conglomerates, Dar al-Mal Islami and Al-Baraka, were managing funds of around $5 billion each at the peak of their success, in comes in Citibank, HSBC and ABN AMRO, managing hundreds of $billions each. Why do you think they entered? Why do you think they entered this mode? Well, firstly, it's a commercial proposition. There's access to liquidity of the Middle East. But secondly, because the risk profile of the Islamic banks was increasingly matching what they were familiar with. And this was not only restricted to the commercial banks. The Islamic Development Bank, we find, between 1975 and 1986 had a radical change in its portfolio. In 1975, its profit loss portfolio consisted of 55% to 1% of otherwise. Its profit loss sharing portfolio in 1955 was 55%. In 1986, it was reduced to 1%. In opposition, in 1975, murabaha was zero, and it went on to become 80%. And the rest of it was taken over by ijara, which similarly had debt-like characteristics. This then charted another course, because once this happened, with murabaha al-amr bil-shara' being the foundation bedrock, we went further and further down a certain direction. And the direction is set by the customer expectations, by the dynamics of the market. And so if we look at all the characteristics of the products that came after that, albeit they have nice Islamic names, and albeit they can be justified from a Sharia position or looking at Islamic law, perhaps by some, although many scholars differ to the nature of these products, it brought about a direction. So murabaha went on to lead to tawarruk, and tawarruk was actually declared not permissible by the recent OIC fatwa. But within the banking sphere, IOFI has said tawarruk is permissible on condition that the commodity does not return back to where it started. But tawarruk, once again, in the Islamic banking industry is different to the tawarruk that we see in the books of fiqh. It's banking tawarruk. Its intention is to mirror short-term liquidity. Bay al-ina, the sale and buyback, was something that was discussed reportedly discussed in books of Shafi fiqh, but they've gone on to become the basis of a secondary debt market in Malaysia. Why? Once again, because it allows you to mirror the effects of a conventional loan. Ijara muntahi bitamlik, the equivalent of a financial lease, once again allows you to mirror the effects of an interest-based loan. And interestingly enough, the nature of ijara, lease, of these corporations is often mitigating the responsible ownership that a lessor has to take. A wakala deposit, which is how banks, Islamic banks, once again manage their short-term liquidity, is once again meant to mirror the effects of a commercial deposit. And once again, the nature of wakala or shared is often mitigated. Islamic profit rate swaps. Well, now that you've got fixed exposure through murabaha and tawarruk and whatever else, you have to want to get a counter exposure. As conventional banks have interest rate swaps, Islamic banks have profit rate swaps. Sukuk, the great discovery, the Islamic market's supposed answer by creating a new equity, quasi-equity product, has consistently had debt-like characteristics. Mufti Taqi in a recent statement said 80% of all the sukuk were not permissible. And as a result, many of the sukuk then shifted from their original wakala or musharaka modes, supposedly wakala and musharaka modes, into ijara modes. Now, there are issues to do with registration, which means ijara of much leased property in the Middle East, which means ijara is non-viable. So we're coming with more and more modes. But the consistent theme, and I probably only come across one sukuk that has not had debt-like characteristics. The consistent theme is fixed income, debt-like characteristics. And this shouldn't be a surprise, because sukuk, in keeping with the theme of Islamic banks, are meant to mirror the function of what are the money markets in conventional banks. Not long ago, we had wa'ad structured products. The idea being that you invest in a product that is supposedly halal and it gives you exposure or access to products that are not halal. Sheikh Yusuf De Lorenzo wrote a paper entitled Sharia Conversion Technology, and he entitled this thing as being the doomsday fatwa of Islamic finance. And I encourage all of you to read this paper, Sheikh Yusuf De Lorenzo's paper. Wa'ad structured products propose to open the whole game. We can now mirror and mimic anything we want. Pork belly funds, alcohol funds, anything you want. This is all part of Islamic finance, diversity and investment. This is the direction we're taking, and this is the direction that has caused many to think we're going down a hole. Some have asserted it's the lizard's hole. In keeping with the Prophet's description, the Prophet Muhammad said, you will follow the people who came before you, shibran bi shibran, handspan bi handspan. Otherwise, until if they were to go down the lizard's hole, you would go down that lizard's hole with them. Here are some quotes. Saleh Kamal, the founder of the Dala Al-Baraka Group, in his acceptance speech for the IDB Bank Prize in 1996, went on to say, I tell you truthfully and without pretense that we went beyond choosing the bank label in Islamic banking to the point of adopting its central essence. Consequently, we failed to give our financial institutions any characteristics beyond simple financial intermediation. This has now been accomplished through Islamic banks' favorite investment modes that are essentially a hybrid between loans and investments, a hybrid which carries most of the characteristics of usurious loans. Mufti Taqi in his paper on sukuk said, undoubtedly Sharia supervisory boards, academic councils and legal seminars have given permission to Islamic banks to carry out certain operations that more closely resemble stratagems, legal stratagems, than actual transactions. But he goes on to say importantly that although this was done to encourage the development of industry, what is happening at the present time is the opposite. Islamic financial institutions have now begun competing to present themselves with all the same characteristics of the conventional interest-based marketplace and to offer new products that march backwards towards interest-based enterprises. So فَأَيْنَ تَذْهَبُونَ? Where are you headed? Backwards. So if we've decided that we're going backwards, and if we've decided that potentially we're going down the lizard's hole, and if we've decided that we don't really know where we're headed, then maybe it's time we redressed the direction. Inevitably, when we talk about redressing direction or looking at a change, we need to understand that with regards to direction of Islamic finance, there's potentially three routes you can take. Route one is, no need to change, it's all the same. And this is when you often find your Uncle G's, who often say, Islamic finance is all the same, and they use the analogy of one person taking his hand and holding his ear the other side, and one person holding his ear this way as all being the same. Often embedded within that analogy is the idea that let me continue taking my interest-based mortgage, let me continue working in a bank, let me continue because it's all the same. I don't want a guilt complex. And those people are not likely to engage in an Islamic finance discussion about real change. The second is the Sharia compliant approach, which is an approach whereby people say, okay, this industry exists, there are certain dynamics to the society we live in, dynamics produced by the legalization of riba. We cannot challenge that because it's impractical, so we need to provide compliant alternatives. By compliant, implying that the Sharia somehow allows for this legal justification as opposed to a moral justification for these things. The third is the third route, which is the Islamic paradigm is actually different, and it has a different social moral basis, and by extension implies a different operational structure. For the intent of this presentation, we're assuming that all of you are in favor of route 3. Let's see what route 3 brings about. To change anything, we need to understand the dynamics of change. When often we discuss change, people say, change has to be practical. Change has to be viable. This is a very illustrative comment, because viability and practicality then goes back to the dominant paradigm of what the person is willing or not willing to accept. If he thinks it's not practical, he can dismiss your idea. And that's why the dynamics of change with regards to Islamic finance could be said to operate on 4 characteristics. Firstly, we need to be willing to change the way we think, the way we understand finance, because our thinking with regards to finance, even if we're not directly engaging in riba, has been conditioned by riba, has been conditioned by the dominant nature of the universal financial system we all engage in. Secondly, this would then entail a difference in how this finance is delivered, it would entail a difference in how this finance is received, and we need to try and bring about infrastructure that supports this. The key questions we need to ask ourselves, and by extension, ask the Islamic finance scholars, and I encourage and I hope Ethica, having done this presentation, would liaise with leading Islamic finance scholars to now answer these questions in a similar public format by giving similar presentations to the public using Ethica as a means. What we want to know from them is, where did we come from? Basically, this financial system, how did it arise? How did we get here? Where do we want to go? When you're articulating Sharia compliance or articulating the Islamic financial system, what is the ultimate goal? And then fourthly, the practicality. How do we get there? How do we get from here to there? These are the questions we want the scholars to articulate. These are the questions we want them to engage with us on. So if the first stage is a paradigm shift, and I think this is the first thing we have to thinking differently, then we need to reintroduce the concept of intention. The Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Actions are by intentions. The idea being that what is it that you're seeking to achieve? When I first started working in Islamic finance, I was introduced to terms I had never come across before in my limited studies of the Sharia. I was told of the Sharia plug. What's a Sharia plug? I remember asking. I was given a look of naivety, i.e. I'm obviously a new joiner in the industry. The idea was this is a mechanism of using special techniques we've derived that allow something that would otherwise be haram to be halal. I looked at the person and I said, but isn't innamal a'malu binniyah? Aren't actions by intentions? It seemed I was speaking a different language because I was rapidly ignored. But when we look at the Quranic parables of people who seek to legalize something that was previously haram by involving themselves in ingenuitive or very interesting legal stratagems, i.e. the people who sought to go against the prohibition of the Sabbath, which prevented them from fishing, by introducing fishing nets the day before, the outcome wasn't a very good one. So intention has to be at the forefront. Intention implies genuineness. Intention implies ethics. Intention implies ethics being at the forefront. As part of the thinking, the change in thinking, we need to start thinking local and acting local. Because through local-based, community-based financial initiatives, we can impact change. We need to understand that the Islamic paradigm makes a clear difference between lending and investing. And we need to be willing to sacrifice the maximization of profit that is accepted as the maxim of Western finance in replacement for a